Welcome to Colorado Reptile Educators, where we educate you about reptiles.
And that education will be evidence-based
to help you advance your keeping and your reptiles' welfare. Well, welcome everybody to another episode with us here at Colorado Reptile Educators. Today is Wednesday, April 23rd, 2023. I'm your host, Lori Trini, with Behavior Education at Spirit Keeper Animal Sanctuary, and my co-host is JZ Proctor. Go ahead and introduce yourself, JZ, to remind everybody who you are.
Yep, it's been a little bit. So JZ Proctor, reptile professional, educator, advocate, as well as small batch breeder of multiple species, mostly snakes.
Okay, fantastic. So we're going to get right into today's agenda, and we're going to start with some herpetology news. And when I was looking up this, I wasn't sure what I would find because I sort of just go through news feeds and look for anything reptile related. And I found something pretty cool, which is that there was a discovery of 5 species of snail-eating snakes that we humans discovered for the first time in South America. And they were discovered in parts of Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama. And so I thought I would just briefly go over what those were. And some of the things that the researchers named them are pretty interesting as well. So, and these snakes are gorgeous. So I'm going to try to share some photos of them. And I'll definitely put a link to the article as well as the scientific journal article in the show notes. But I found this article from February of this year in the Miami Herald, actually. And so these snail-eating snakes are pretty small. They're around 2 feet long, and they're really colorful. And of course, we have no idea to really know how long they've been around, but researchers discovered them just recently. And the first one is named Saibon Ermelinda Caprioe, and it's actually named after Leonardo DiCaprio's mother. Yeah. So I guess they are very involved in conservation efforts, and they named this snake, after their family. I thought that was interesting. Now, all of these snakes look pretty similar. They're really, really bug-eyed. They have really big heads in relation to their bodies, and they have really big bug eyes. So I'm going to go over what they are, and then I'll share some photos of them. But again, they're all about 2 feet long, including this one named after the DiCaprios. And colloquially, or the common name, is the DiCaprio snail-eating snake. And the article says that they're docile and they never attempted to bite researchers. They are about 2 feet long. They have really bright orange eyes and bands of reddish orange, white, and brown on their bodies. So actually the colors kind of reminded me of just a wild type horn snake, but a little bit brighter, and their eyes really do look ruby red. So the second species was just called the Saibon canopy snake, or they're calling it just commonly the canopy snail-eating snake. And that one has really super bright ruby eyes. All of these look pretty similar. Then there's one called Marley's snail-eating snake, and it's kind of got burnt orange eyes and a charcoal colored tongue. It's got speckled scales and it's blended colors of maroon, orange, yellow, and white. That one was found in Ecuador and Colombia. And again, all of these eat snails. The fourth species is the Saibon virii, or Vera's snail-eating snake. It's just a little over 2 feet long, and it has brown eyes, and its skin and scales are browns and whites and greens, and it's more of a earth tone color than these others. And then the very last one researchers discovered for the first time is the Dipsis wellborni, or well-born snail-eating snake. And it's another one that looks pretty brown in color. So what I'm going to do is see if I can share my screen with you guys and show you what these look like. And this is directly from the paper. So these are the species, and you can see that some of them are really bright oranges and reds, and then some of them are more earth toned or browns. And I'll also pull up real quick the Miami Herald article, which I'm sure enhanced these photos from the paper, because these snakes are beautiful. And the Miami Herald article, though, they're really bright, and so I'm sure that they probably enhanced them. So let me see if I can share that with you. I'll share screen.
The most flamboyant is the DiCaprio.
Yeah. So I'm going to scroll back up to the top of this article. So this one is the DiCaprio snail-eating snake. And this is the one that reminded me of the corn snake colors. But see how the head is it's kind of got a bug head too, like a big roundish ovally head. And then it's got these huge bug eyes and the body is very slender. And then this is the one that is just stunning. Look at that. Look at those eyes and the colors of red. I mean, that just looks like rubies for eyes. It's almost doesn't even look real.
Yeah, I bet have you seen all that new AI art that they've been putting up? Like the AI photographs of stuff that almost makes me think that someone would be concerned that it wasn't even a real animal.
Well, I know these are real because I did look up the original scientific journal article that was published, and there are pictures of all these snakes in there. I just find the ones in this article in the Miami Herald a little bit more vibrant.
Oh, yeah.
And this is the canopy snail-eating snake, this one right here. And so then let's look at this one. This is the Vera's snail-eating snake, and this is the one that's brown, but I don't know if you can see how speckled the eyes are. And the speckling inside the eyes actually match the speckling on the skin. So I thought that was pretty cool.
It's coming through pretty good on the screen, so it should translate well, I think.
Okay, I hope so. But you guys can always look up this article on your own. This is the well-born eye, or the well-born snail-eating snake. And this was actually, I felt like, the most subdued coloration of all of these snakes. I just think they all look pretty cool. It says that they were all pretty docile and they didn't try to bite researchers. So I'll share that article link in the show notes. I'll also share the link to find the original scientific paper if you guys want to read about it. But I was pretty excited to find that as a news item. And I thought those snakes were so neat looking.
Those are really cool. I bet a lot of people will be wanting to actually keep those as pets, but I'm not sure
Well,
that would
they
be the
eat
smartest
snails.
idea. Yeah, exactly.
So, I don't know how difficult they would be to keep as pets, and seeing how they were just found in the wild, by researchers for the first time, I don't know how easily they would be obtained as pets, but they certainly are beautiful.
I would hope not terribly easily, in all honesty.
With how small they are, I don't know, to me they just look delicate, and that always makes me nervous. I like a big, medium, chunky snake that I feel like it would be difficult to accidentally harm.
Right. Cool.
All right, so you have a vocabulary term for us today.
Yes, I do. So this is a really cool and interesting word that applies to not just reptiles, but actually applies to a lot of different wild animals. So generally when we're talking about wild animals, and reptiles specifically, because that's what we keep, we think about their periods of activity. And a lot of times those come into two general terms, which is diurnal and nocturnal, being their time of their period of activity during the day, diurnal, and at night, nocturnal. However, many of our popular reptile species, specifically snakes, but lots of lizards and amphibians are another term, which is crepuscular. And crepuscular essentially means being active in the dawn and dusk period. So, for instance, the royal pythons, the ball pythons, those are the ones that their period of activity starts a little bit right before the sun goes down. They come out, they absorb that residual ultraviolet light, heat from the ground, and then they go hunting into a couple hours into the night. And then sometimes they're active right at dawn, right when it's just the sun starting to come up into a little bit into the daylight, and then they go back down to the burrows. But there's actually a much different period of activity that applies to not only lots of mammals and birds, but also some reptiles. And that term is called cathemeral. And that traces back into Greek roots, which is kata, meaning through, and then hemera, which basically means the day. So cathemeral Greek roots is through the day. And generally what that means is it's essentially not just one period of activity and then a long period of rest or sleep. It's actually multiple intermittent periods throughout the 24 hours of the day, both dawn, dusk, middle of the day, middle of the night. A good example of one would be something like a lion. We all hear the term that lions sleep 20 hours a day or whatever, and that's because they are actively hunting or taking part in different social situations, interactions throughout the day. It doesn't matter, rain, night, dawn, dusk, all sorts of things that are just kind of dependent on a day-to-day basis. And there are several different snake species that are in fact cathemeral. A really good example of that is a bull snake. during their just general activity period. So April to late October, we'll say, is the kind of period when they are not in a period of rumination. They will be active in the middle of the night, middle of the day, road cruising at 100 degrees, and they're out. Middle of the night, they're out. Dawn, dusk, when you normally be seeing other animals. And they are active at all different times of the day, depending on all sorts of different stuff. Another really good example is a European ladder snake. Those are found in parts of southern France and Italy, which is the popular vacation destination of everybody in Europe, where they also, like people, like that really nice warm climate day and night during their period of activity, and they are out all of the time during all hours. And so they're a very commonly seen species in that part of Europe, just like we have the bull snakes here, not only in Colorado where we are, but in multiple other different areas as well. So it's a really cool thing. And also there are plenty of other more commonly kept ones like doomerals, boas are also considered a cathemeral species as well, which again, to ring it all and wrap it all back up, it basically means just periods of activity intermittent throughout that 24-hour period, not just dupe or dupe.
Okay, very cool. That was a great choice. I have had a few clients that have asked me about that word actually lately and are asking me what species that might be available in the pet trade for them to get that would fit into that category. Because while I am a nocturnal person, I'm up late at night, and my nocturnal species or crepuscular species fit in just great with my schedule. A lot of people are awake during the day, or their schedule changes and they want to see their snakes whenever they happen to be up and about. And bull snakes are a great example. We have a bull snake here and we have a gopher snake here, and they seem to wake up and get active whenever I'm in the room, whether it's the middle of the night or the middle of the day, because I feel like they associate my activity with maybe they're going to get to come out, or they're going to get food, or something's going to happen.
More than likely, that certainly seems to be the case, especially in the case of like the ladder rats, where their activity and their being seen essentially directly coincides with tourist season as well, to where it's when more people are there, it seems like more prey is abundant, or something happens to where even during their general period of activity during that time frame where they're not cremating as well, they're not quite as seen. I mean, not even just because there are more people around, they just seem to be more active when people are around too. It's just really interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting, because so many snake species you never see when people are around. And it's kind of the same with some mammal species like wolves. You know, you never see them if people are around. It's very hard to find them. So it's interesting that there are a few species that actually come out when people are active.
Yep, it's really interesting.
All right, so our next portion is called Query, where one of us goes over a question that somebody asked us during an outreach presentation, or maybe a client or somebody that contacted us, maybe over social media asked us, but just a general question that we were asked. And so I picked one out, and I was recently asked by a group of elementary students, well, a whole lot of questions, but I spoke to an after-school herpetology club that was full of elementary school students. And one of them asked me what the smallest species of snake in the world was. And I wasn't actually sure at the time, because I don't really look at the smallest species of snakes. I like medium or larger snakes, and that's what I work with. So I had to actually look that up, and it's actually the thread snakes. And that's Leptotyphlops carlae is the one that I found, which is the smallest snake in the world. It was discovered in 2008 in the Caribbean island of Barbados. And I read that adult thread snakes can grow up to about 4 inches or 10 centimeters long, making them the tiniest snakes in the world. So if you are trying to picture how small 10 centimeters or 4 inches is, it is really, really tiny. And so let me share my screen again. I'm going to do a lot of screen sharing today, because I pulled up some photos of thread snakes on Google Images. And this is a baby one that's shown on $0.25 or a 25-cent piece. And then here are some photos of some in people's hands. And they actually really look like little worms. Like here's a photo of somebody wearing one on their finger.
Yeah.
So it would frighten me to no end to try to care for a thread snake, because they are so stinking tiny. There's just no way. You know, I would would be scared to feed them, to handle them, to try to take care of them. I would be afraid I would definitely lose them. But it's certainly fascinating that we have snakes in the world as long as the reticulated python, over 20 feet, as heavy and big round as the anaconda. And then we have something as tiny as 4 inches or 10 centimeters. It's just crazy.
Yeah, no, they're so cool looking. I remember for a long time, it hasn't happened as much recently, but a lot of people they would get little thread snakes and blind snakes in their potted plants. There's a couple species that are really prominent down in Florida. And so a lot of people, they would get like the Cuban tree frogs that are invasive down there, and then they get a lot of those blind and thread snakes.
Wow, that's interesting. So I was happy actually that little herpetology club asked me some really good questions. So I learned some things from them, and hopefully they learned some things from me as well. So now we're going to move on to a resource review, and I have no idea what the resource is, but Jay-Z is going to review a resource for all of us.
Yes. So this one probably skews a little bit further from a lot of the academic stuff that we normally stick with, but this one is actually full of really good information specifically about our hobby, at least here in the United States. So this book is called Reptile Odyssey. It's by Bill Love. Now, Bill Love is one of the, I guess you could call them, and his wife Kathy, are kind of like some of the founding fathers of our industry here in the hobby. Other people would include, like Tom Crutchfield and people like them, where they were some of the very first ones to get in and acquire some of these animals in this country, establish them, and kind of set the groundwork for the hobby that it is today in all of its both good and bad. And it goes into quite a bit of detail about that, to where it starts off with him, and this is essentially an autobiography of Bill Love. This is probably a, TV-14 rated kind of type of book. So maybe not necessarily for like younger kids. There's a little bit of colorful language on here. But it's kind of like a really, really good book that starts off with him as a kid, doing what a lot of the reptile individual and hobbyists did, catching reptiles and learning about them and their natural habitats and translating that into keeping them the way that a lot of people used to, kind of before the boom of like YouTube and social media, where it was essentially they just kept them in, like they'd scoop up dirt and grass and sticks that they would find them out in the wild, and that's how they would keep them. And then we switched to this kind of sterile thing, and that talks a little bit about this in here. And well, now we're starting to go back to what it used to be, trying to keep them in like living habitats and ecosystems. Talks about how they grew one of the largest industries, reptile industries, to then shrinking back down, doing like ecotourism, where they're taking people out to like Madagascar and places like that, where they're learning about the environment and things like that, which again is, I'm a big proprietor of. If you don't know about something, how can you expect people to care about it? And this is a really good book about that. It explains his journey, as well as eventually meeting his wife Kathy, and kind of the stuff that they've gotten up to until, I think this came out in, I think 2012 or something. So it's a little bit dated at this point, but a really, really good book filled with a lot of really good information. And if you're someone who really enjoys this hobby and wants to know kind of more about the history of things and why things are the way they are, and maybe learning from that history and growing this hobby, this is a really good book to check out. It's published by Eco right there. That's a really good publishing house. They do a lot of really, really cool and interesting books that are more than just these kind of fun autobiographies, but actually do go into a lot of actual species specific care books and information as well.
I actually have the corn snake book by Kathy Love, and it's over 20 years old, but there's a passage in it where she talks about captivity stress and how we don't provide enough natural things in the enclosures for the animals, and that part of why some of the animals have trouble with acclimatization is because of captivity stress. And she talks about providing outlets for their natural behavior and putting naturalistic things in the enclosures. And that book is over 20 years old. And that really surprised me to read that, thinking, well, people had this in mind and were doing this so long ago. What happened in between that now we have people not doing that? As somebody that's only really been engrossed in the reptile community for about the last 5 or 6 years, it was something that struck me, how some people keep animals, because it isn't like, I've worked with all sorts of species, and it wouldn't occur to me to keep animals in a drawer. Or it seems natural that you would keep animals in some type of setting that is like their natural habitat as best as you can. But it's not just the reptile community that's guilty of it. The equine community is very guilty of this too, because lots of people keep horses in 12 by 12 box stalls. And that's absolutely so far from their natural behavior and natural habitat that it's crazy. So I'm not just picking on reptile people, but I was really impressed that that book by Kathy Love, that was, over 20 years old, was already pointing out that we need to be providing that to reduce their stress under captive management, which, it impressed me.
Mm-hmm.
And I know she was on your show too. Didn't you interview her?
Yep. That was a really fun little talk. We had a few technical issues, but really, we talked a lot about, we did get into that subject a little bit as well too. So
everybody will have to check that out on your Keep Calm, It's Just a Snake podcast.
Yep. One of the very few imaginative things I've ever had.
I like that name. Okay, so next I'm going to go over a behavior bit. And I am an animal behaviorist and animal trainer. That's sort of my area of expertise. I've studied animal health and behavior, and I sort of lean more towards the behavior aspect of that study. And so if you are a Python Regis keeper, a royal python keeper, you've perhaps noticed that sometimes it seems like they eat really, really well and they're right on target with their strikes. And then you might notice that sometimes they miss their food, or they seem scared to strike at their food, or they're not as outgoing at trying to acquire their food as they once were. And I've certainly noticed that in target training them. And what I noticed is I would get some of them at a very, very young age. The youngest that I acquired was 3.5 weeks old. And then I acquired several that were under 4 months old. And they always picked up target training really quickly and would follow the target, and they would snatch their reinforcer, which I use food to reinforce that behavior. And then I started noticing as they were getting older, 8 to 12 months old, that they started to hesitate to follow the target or move to the target, that they started sometimes to wildly strike in a direction that was nowhere near where their food was. And I thought, well, this is really odd. Why are they doing this? And I have a couple of older adult royals. I have one that's 25 years old and a couple that are 7 years old, and they don't do that. They usually strike once and get their prey and they eat it. And so I wondered if there was any research, that I wasn't aware of into this phenomenon, and there actually is. So there was a paper published in 2020, and it's called The Ontogeny of Strike Performance in Ball Pythons or Python Regis, a 3-year longitudinal study. It was published in the journal Zoology, and it was by W.G. Ryerson. So a longitudinal study, and we definitely need more of these, especially in animal behavior science, but a longitudinal study is where you're watching a group of animals for a long period of time, not just for a month or for 6 weeks, but for a while. And so this researcher watched this group of Python Regis for 3 years. And what he found, according to this longitudinal study on their strike performance, is that Python Regis demonstrate a steep decline in strike performance as they reach about 18 months of age. And that juvenile ball pythons, so hatchlings and younger ones, have documented strike performance and ability to acquire and manage their prey with the same rapidity and kinematics. So that's the same speed and sort of efficiency and use of their body as adult snakes. However, as these individuals grew into adolescence, the researchers took several measurements and determined that for real, their performance declined. So their strike velocity declined, their acceleration towards the prey declined, the maximum amount that they opened their mouth declined, the speed at which they opened their mouth to grab the prey declined, and overall, their strike performance declined, and they were having multiple unsuccessful strikes at around 18 months of age when they were trying to acquire their prey. So it really reaffirmed for me that I wasn't just imagining that the snakes were getting worse with their target training as they reached adolescence. And then as they were adults, they sort of got better at it again. this is actually not common across snake species. It's something that's seen for whatever reason in royal pythons, and the authors of this paper didn't know why. They had some speculation. I had some speculation as to maybe why they were doing it, but we don't know why this happens. It could be an artifact of captivity. We don't know if they do this in the wild or not. I was thinking, well, maybe they're actually smarter than we think, and they're trying to like think, oh, if that prey's running in front of me, it'll be over here by the time I strike. So I'll strike over here, you know, even though my keeper's holding the prey right in front of me. But I maybe gave them too much credit because the researchers in this paper really didn't have an explanation. And we're actually thinking maybe because they're under captive management, they're sort of not utilizing their hunting abilities to the maximum extent. And maybe they're basically losing some of their efficiency at hunting because we make it so easy for them under captive management. They're not trying as hard. They're not working as hard. They're not developing these skills. So I did look up some papers about other snakes, and there are a whole bunch of other papers about different species of snakes, to include bull snakes, gopher snakes, elapids, vipers, garter snakes, corn snakes. All of those papers indicate that strike performance, prey handling, acquisition, and just general prey management increases and becomes more efficient with experience and age. That's the norm. And that's actually what I see with the target training too. Usually when I start target training a snake, they just keep getting better and better at it and more efficient at it, and they catch on. Not so with Python Regis. Again, we really don't know why, but I want to reassure you, if you have Python Regis as pets, that, you know, you're not doing anything wrong. It's a natural stage that they seem to go through mid-adolescence, like 18 months to 3 years old. They might miss their food. They might miss their strikes. They might be reluctant to strike. I say just stick with them because my older ones are just doing fine. And so I would say just chill out, be patient, don't get upset about it, and just let them go through this, but keep challenging them. You know, don't over challenge them, but give them achievable challenges so that if that behavior is due to captive management, that we are giving them appropriate challenges under captive management to help them hone their hunting skills and using their body to acquire prey and not making them sort of lazy about it. Jay-Z, have you noticed this with any of yours? You breed royal pythons.
Yep. So I'm curious about that study. If you post the link about that, I'm curious if how they were keeping them has anything to do with it, because I know they've had studies about, you know, muscle mass and strength of animals that are fed exclusively frozen thaw, exclusively live, in tubs, in larger enclosures. They've had studies about that to show essentially the pluses and minuses of both of those styles of keeping, as well as there is kind of this common colloquial thing that is sometimes more often correct than not, which is in subadult ball pythons, typically they usually say in that 400 to 800 gram range, which, if being not power fed and fed appropriately, amounts typically sits in that 1.5 to 2.5 year stage of life, where they will go off food, or they become reluctant to strike or fearful to eat, and their growth kind of stops for a little while. And a lot of keepers have said that. A lot of breeders have said that, both who keep in small tubs and large breeding facilities, both as pets, that's only 1 or 2 animals and they have them in appropriately sized enclosures. And so it is entirely possible that maybe the reason why that we really like the royal so much is that they also kind of go through a teenage angst period, and we just are kind of essentially empathizing with them a little bit more than we do several other species. So in addition to like the pyramid scheme that are ball pythons, maybe we just kind of empathize with them a little bit more because their complex emotions have something to do with that. Who knows?
Yeah, they're having like a gangly teenage phase. So this is actually, can you see my screen share?
Yeah.
This is actually from the paper, and it shows a successful strike sequence on this side and an unsuccessful strike sequence over here, where it's, and I've seen it even worse than this, where they're not even this close.
Oh yeah.
In this number 130, if you look there, where they're like missing the food that's right in front of them. But I have seen them literally strike to the right or left, like nowhere even close to the food.
Yep, it's where I've talked to some people who exactly what you're referring to, where they were freaking out that they had neurological issues like the spider ball pythons, where who they lack coordination with that has tied to that genetic morph, but they were concerned that there was something else going on with their animals because of what you're describing right now.
Right. So it's normal and you don't need to worry about it. And I will definitely post the link to this paper because they go through in a lot of detail. Like they studied the kinematics, which is exactly how the snake's body is moving.
Yeah.
So how their mouth is moving, how their neck is moving, how their body's moving. They measured the speed. I mean, they measured the performance in relation to the snake's body size. So it was pretty detailed. And if anybody's interested in reading more about it, I will definitely share this. I just think if nothing else, it reassured me that I wasn't suddenly doing something wrong with my training. And I didn't think so because I have all these other snake species here. I have Brettles pythons, carpet pythons. I have the rough scale python. I've got children's pythons. I have corn snakes. I have all these other species and they only get better at target training.
Right.
You know, this doesn't happen with them. So I was trying to figure out what was going on and it kind of even reassured me. So hopefully it reassures keepers that if you're seeing this in your royal, just don't worry about it. You know, just be patient and let them be. And they will maybe have to try several times, but they'll get it. They'll find their food and they're not going to starve. The thing that I would say is don't do for as a little behavior bit here on top of what was in the paper is don't chase your royal with the food. Don't stick it in their face. Don't hit them with it because that can frighten them. And if they become afraid of their food, then they're going to be less likely to eat it in the future. So what I have found that is successful is you show them the food. And if you slowly move it away, sometimes that instigates them to come after it.
Yep.
Versus you sticking it in their face, which can be scary and confrontational, and then they panic. And this is a species that other studies have shown get really stressed very easily. So you don't want to cause them to have negative associations with their meal. So don't hit them with it, chase them with it, stick it in their face. You know, give them an opportunity to take their time to come at it, or even slowly pull it away. And sometimes that will prompt them to come for it.
Yep, feeding a bunch of animals is certainly always a fun little process.
Well, it does seem more work with Python Regis because like a lot of my other snakes, it doesn't matter how I feed them. They're just going to take the food and be done with it.
Really are good for that.
So it's just something to keep in mind. If you are a Royal Python owner, be patient with them, understand that they are a little bit different and just it's normal. You know, don't be worried that something is wrong with them.
Yep.
All right. So next, Jay-Z, I think you're going to do legit or lore for us. And you're going to go over some folklore husbandry or folklore idea in reptile keeping and tell us whether it's actually real or not.
Okay, so this is going to be another one because I just like to throw curveballs, which is going to be not solidly 100% lore or legit. So, as we've all have one reptile, more than likely, if you're listening to this, we've probably heard some very interesting little tales out there of, you know, ball pythons like this, and bearded dragons need this, and leopard geckos don't need this, and all these different things. But there's one that has been very consistent with any and all species of snakes, and even some lizards, which is that if you feed inside of the enclosure, no matter what kind of enclosure you're keeping it in, tub, fish tank, large enclosure, whatever it is, they will slowly but surely start to associate that opening of the cage with food. Now, there is some evidence to suggest that, to where repeated activities and repeated behaviors, both on their part and on our part as their keepers, does show that, where they will start to associate the glass or whatever it is opening, there is going to be some sort of interaction that will be happening to them, be it food, positive or negative, to affect them, be it stressful or whatever the case may be. But if you are someone who your real only interaction with that animal is just feeding it, that could likely be the case, and it could result in a feeding response because of that repeated behavior. And so another reason why they say is to feed it in an enclosure that doesn't have to do with that. It doesn't smell like their enclosure and all these other things. Another reason why they suggest to do this is just so that way it allows them to not be overwhelmed, or something that I've heard like this is to be overwhelmed with your enclosure. If you have a very cluttered enclosure or something that they feel very secure in, they may not feel bold enough or have any sort of predatory response to actually get that animal. So if you put them in a very neutral space, essentially, it will hopefully trigger a feeding response. As I'm sure that Lori can attest, not 100% true. It's when you have an animal that theoretically you're interacting with them more than just once a week feeding it, and then once every other week cleaning up its urates and spot cleaning, you're going to have other interactions that will lead away from that. And there are plenty of other little kind of tips and tricks to kind of help disassociate that with just only food. And that's a whole other conversation. But feeding an animal in their enclosure has no real world practices or real 100% concrete evidence to suggest that they will always associate that with food. Are there individuals of not just one species, but multiple species that are more inclined to have that food response? Sure. But again, it's individualistic, it's repetitive behavior, it's learned behavior, and it's training behavior that you can learn to work with your animals. Lori works with Veritime with their target training, not only for just feeding, but actually for moving in and out of their enclosures, which is something that really cool that Lori's talked about multiple times on their channel.
Yeah. So that was a great topic. And what you're talking about there is we as keepers inadvertently instill habitual behaviors in our snakes and other animals, and we don't realize we're doing it. So if you only are opening the door feeding, opening the door feeding, opening the door feeding, in the beginning stages, that was a goal-directed behavior on your snake's part, to see that the door was opening, to see that there was food, to make the effort to go after the food and acquire it and eat it. But after that's done over and over and over again, now it becomes habit if you're not interacting with your snake in any other way.
Yep.
And so it's actually a different part of the brain that is involved in goal-directed behavior versus habit. And once something becomes habitual, now you're opening the door and the snake is having an automatic reaction of striking without thinking, oh, the door's opening, I'm probably going to get food. Oh yeah, there's food. Oh yeah, I have to do something to acquire that food. That's much different than door open, strike, door open, strike. And what we inadvertently train them to do is that if we aren't teaching them a specific signal, that means it's dinner time. And certainly if we're not interacting with them at other times enough. So I have a snake sitting right here on my desk in a glass enclosure. He sees me during most of my awake hours doing all sorts of stuff outside of his enclosure, none of which means he's going to eat. He has a very specific signal that means I'm going to feed you now, and that's a target. And so there's never any habit that's learned, and there's never any confusion about when he's going to eat. So that was a really good one to bring up. We inadvertently instill some of these automatic responses in our snakes when we don't mean to, but it's basically because we repeat behaviors and we're not doing enough variety of behaviors with our snakes, and we're not being very clear to teach them signals that mean this signal means you're going to eat, this signal means I'm going to pick you up, and all of these other things don't mean anything.
Yep, exactly.
I appreciate you bringing that up.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I had a feeling it was going to be a fun one to build.
Yeah. So are we going to do our real or ridiculous now?
I'm totally up for it. I have some interesting ones that I think might throw you a curveball that are dated back from the 1800s to a couple years ago. Okay, so to recap, these are 3 different things that have to do with, theoretically based in herpetology, both mostly historical, but not necessarily, that 2 of them are 100% correct, and one there could be something off about, and it may not be correct. So here we go. And I'm going to do my best because I have a couple non-American names on here, and I'll do my best not to butcher them. As anyone who's ever watched my personal videos, we know it's a struggle. So to start things off with, French zoologist André-Marie Constant Dumeril, the renowned professor, author, member of the American Philosophical Society, and cataloger of thousands of species, whom over a dozen different ones, not just reptiles, but different plants and fish species are named after, have published many volumes, including Zoologie in 1806 and the Catalogue méthodique de la collection des reptiles in 1851. However, despite being a French-born man and being elected to the American Philosophical Society, was never elected to the French Academy of Sciences.
Okay.
So that's one. I wish
All
I would have
right.
typed this up for you to send it to you so you can review, but I can repeat these if you need to.
Okay, well, I invited, because Troy couldn't join us tonight, I
Yeah.
invited my husband to participate in this part, so you might have to read him again for him once he joins us.
Totally fine.
And that's going to be totally like, because he's not even a reptile person, that should be totally interesting.
It will be fun. Okay. You ready for the second one?
I'm ready.
All right. Reptile Gardens, the famous reptile zoo in Rapid City, South Dakota, started as a roadside attraction in 1935 by a young tour guide and snake enthusiast Earl Broxby, or Brocklesby. I can never get his name right. It expanded to a large building, and after World War II, business exploded and steadily grew and became the world's largest reptile zoo. And it actually is the Guinness Book World's Records for the most amounts of a single species, and in this case, Crotalus viridis, or the prairie rattlesnake.
Okay, reptile gardens. All right.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. And so the last one, and I'm going to do my best not to butcher her name because she deserves all the accolades for this one. Maria Cristina Adrila Robiao was a Colombian herpetologist and professor who was integral to the collection and cataloging of dozens of species, as well as working with different caiman and crocodile species in efforts for species restoration. She is credited with 28 new species, but after her death was actually posthumously in 2017 now credited with 31.
Okay, what was her name again?
Maria Cristina Adrila Robiao.
Okay. All right. Jim, do you need to hear those again?
Might need to.
Okay.
It's
Here, you
ridiculous.
can sit here and he'll read them again, and that'll give me an opportunity to think about them.
Ah, okay.
Okay. So, from the top, first one. The renowned and famed French zoologist André-Marie Constant Dumeril was a professor and an author and a member of the American Philosophical Society. He cataloged thousands of species, with whom over a dozen are named after, and he published many volumes, including the famous Zoologie in 1806 and Catalogue méthodique de la collection des reptiles, I'm sure I mispronounced that in French, in 1851. But despite being a French citizen and being elected to the American Philosophical Society, was never elected to the French Academy of Sciences.
Okay.
So that's the first one. The second one, Reptile Gardens. The Reptile Zoo in Rapid City, South Dakota, started as a roadside attraction in 1935 by a young tour guide of the area and snake enthusiast Earl Brocklesby. It expanded to a large building, and after World War II, business steadily increased and then exploded in popularity to what it is today, now considered the world's largest reptile zoo, and is the Guinness Book of Records for holding the most amount of Crotalus viridis, or the prairie rattlesnake, in its building.
Third
Okay.
one.
And then so the last one, Maria Cristina Adrila Robiao was a Colombian herpetologist and professor. She was integral to the collection and cataloging of dozens of species, as well as working with different caiman and crocodile species in efforts for species restoration. She was credited with discovering 28 new species, but posthumously in 2017, she is now credited with 31.
You want to guess first?
I get these, which one's the,
You have to guess which one is the ridiculous one. Which one is?
I think the first one is, the second one is fake. I think-
The second one is fake?
Reptile Garden?
Yeah, the snake one with the reptile gardens. I think that's ridiculous.
Okay,
Okay.
that is actually correct.
That it's ridiculous.
No, it is true.
It is true. Okay.
Yes. it
Wait,
is true.
I have to guess.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought we were doing one or the other. I apologize.
Now she'll get it right.
Well, now I know that that one's true. Now I have a 50-50 chance on the other ones.
But I'm pretty sure you thought that one was correct anyway,
Okay.
knowing you.
See, these other two sound so true.
Right?
And of course, the name Doomerl, there's a
Mm.
Doomerl's boa named after Doomerl, but I don't actually know what else that person. So I don't know the whole history of this person or what that person did. The part that makes me think that's probably true is knowing French people the way I do and knowing France, they probably didn't put him into the French society that you mentioned that he didn't get inducted into. So I am going to say that one is true and that the last one about Maria is the fake, is the ridiculous one.
Okay. You ready?
Yeah.
Drum roll. You are both incorrect.
Oh.
He was actually invited into the French Academy of Science before he was elected to the American Philosophical Society. And then his son, who actually went on to help publish several other of his own writings, as well as helping his father Andre multiple times, actually took his position on the French Academy of Sciences.
Well, that makes me feel better. I mean, I'm glad about that, but I was like doubtful. I thought, well, that would be something that they would do, is not induct him in.
Other than the dig on the French.
Well, my writing coach is French, and he now lives in the United States. So what does that tell you?
Hey, I'm technically French too. So, Maria Cristina, who, and I'm sure I am butchering her last name. It's Adria Rabial, with a little hyphen. She was a professor in Colombia, and she worked with a lot of the different species of caiman, especially after a lot of the deforestation and the skin trade, essentially, of several of the different caiman species. And so she worked heavily with the Colombian government, as well as international places, both in the colleges that she worked in and with the government of Colombia, to help restore different crocodilian populations down there. And then throughout all of her graduate work into her professional and collegiate careers, she did help essentially discover all these new species of reptiles.
Okay, so Doomerl's is false, is the
Doomerl's
ridiculous
false.
one, and the Reptile Garden and the Maria one are real.
Yes.
Just so that our listeners and our viewers
Fail.
know.
Fail.
Pleasure, we don't know what we're talking about.
This is
Yes, I
so
apologize.
this is really fun, but it just shows you how difficult it is, because all of those sounded like they could be true.
Yes, and I wasn't going to throw you like a date one, because that would just be mean. So that's why I was trying to throw a slight different one about that, while still maintaining as correct as I could.
Okay, so the Doomerl one is the ridiculous one. The other two are true. I didn't actually know that Reptile Gardens was in South Dakota, because we've been to South Dakota. Why didn't we go there?
Because we were looking at horses.
I mean, honestly, a lot of reptile people, we go there once, and then it's just kind of, okay.
It's there. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, we did go to South Dakota, and we brought back 2 wild Mustangs. And so I guess that we weren't thinking about reptiles at that time.
I mean, I went to reptile gardens and look at reptiles, and I brought home a cat. So,
Okay. So now, following that, you expect me to do, have you heard of this reptile?
I mean, yeah, sure, why not? I think it's a really cool one. It's on
Okay.
my bucket list, and I really want one.
So have you heard of A rough-scaled python, Morelia carinata. I actually have a Morelia carinata here, and I recently did a YouTube video about that species and about that snake. And I'm going to give you, while I'm thinking about it, some other resources, and I'll also put these in the video description. I'm not the only one that has resources about rough-scaled pythons. So the brand new, more complete carpet python by Nick Mutton and Justin Julander has a whole chapter on Morelia carinata, the rough-scaled python. There is an actual scientific journal paper called The Natural History of the Rough-Scaled Python. And then Girl with Scales, my friend Summer Grace Melville, did a really good video about rough-scaled pythons on her YouTube channel. Criticam with Peter Birch has a video about the rough-scaled python. And then Morelia Python Radio in their natural history series. They have a couple of interviews where people are interviewed about raising and breeding rough-scaled pythons under captive management. And then there's a really cool write-up by the Perth Zoo that you can go to and read about it. So now that I've given you all of these resources for you to look up this snake yourself, what actually is it? It's actually the only species of python that has keeled scales. And keeled scales are the type of scales that you would find on rattlesnakes, hognose snakes, bull snakes, gopher snakes. There's lots of colubrids and vipers that have keeled scales. They're the kind of scales that stick up to a point in the middle, and if you touch them, they feel rough. So hence the name rough-scaled python. But it's the only python species that has these keeled scales. And they are native to Australia, and they are native to a very, very small range in Western Australia. They're very, very difficult to find, apparently, in the wild. And for many, many years, people had only documented seeing about 10. And in more recent years, according to the write-up in the More Complete Carpet Python, since more roads have been built into that area and some habitat destruction has occurred, it's easier for people to get in there. And I guess there's been about 17 sightings of rough-scaled pythons in more recent years. But they are, as far as I know, the rarest python species in the world. They have the smallest native range in the world. They're only found in this one small part of Western Australia. And they're the only python species that have keeled scales. They're a very interesting species for other reasons too. They're basically have no ontogenic color change. So they are born as babies the way they're going to look as adults. I will overlay, once I edit this video, pictures of my rough-scaled python into this video so that you can see what he looks like. His name is Songral, and I got him from Ralph Polinsky at Midwest Serpentarium. I know that he's hatching another clutch of rough-scaled pythons this year. I know Brett Bender has also bred them before. I don't know if he has any this year, but they are more readily available under captive management than they once were in the past. And that is thanks to five rough-scaled pythons that were collected from the wild during an expedition that was a whole big thing where they had to take helicopters and hike in and all kinds of stuff.
Okay. It's crazy.
To get these animals out, and they only got 5. And so every rough-scaled python under captive management today worldwide, so those in Australia and those that were legally imported to the United States and the United Kingdom or Europe, are all descended from those original 5 animals that were brought into captivity. So they don't have a lot of genetic diversity so far because they're not bred in high numbers. We haven't seen any issues with that, no inbreeding issues or bottlenecking issues. I don't know if we could expect that to happen in the future. Mine's really healthy and has no problems, but again, they're not widely produced either. But all of them are related to those original 5 animals. They do change color, but not from birth to adulthood. They can change color over several hours to become a darker or lighter brown, and it is not known why they do that. It's called a physiologic color change. We don't know why, but it's speculated that it has something to do with camouflage. So they live in rocky areas They're found in rock crevices. They're pretty much arboreal. They're not found on the ground very often. And their closest living relative are the green tree pythons. So if you think of a green tree python and how little they move and how they can spend hundreds of days at a time in a tree, these rough-scale pythons, they're called saxicolous. And that means that they live or spend most of their time in rocks or in rocky areas. So they live on rock ledges, in rock crevices. They will use trees, but they're very much associated with rocky water courses, and they never get too far from water. Of course, water is a very scarce resource in some parts of Australia that has undergone a period of aridization in their geologic history. It's becoming drier and drier there. And the rough-scale python's habitat used to be much larger when water levels were different, but through geologic history, their habitat has shrunk and it's gotten drier. And so now they live in these rocky areas. They do live in some mangrove forests, and they live pretty close to water. They're not usually found that far from water. Not that they're in the water, but they stay close to the water. And I know that mine drinks quite a bit. He doesn't like get in the water and swim around and stuff, but he stays close to it. They will appreciate under captive management lots of places to get up high. They're going to use like elevated caves and rocks and sky heights and shelves and ledges. And if those are textured, so much the better. They really like that. So part of this color change is thought to be to camouflage themselves in these different colors of rocks. So if you think of a rocky cavern or a rocky watercourse or an area of the world that's just really rocky, you know that the rocks have different shades and different colors. And so it stands to reason that the snake would be able to camouflage itself better if it could get a lighter or darker brown, depending on what rocks it's next to. And then the rough scales, it's not known why they evolved to have these rough scales, and they're the only python species that has evolved these rough scales, but that's another speculation is camouflage and to grip onto these rocks better, right? And these rocky ledges and these rocky outcroppings, and to affix themselves in rock crevices so things can't pull them out, and that they're secure in there and they don't fall. If your scales are rough, it's going to be easier for you to do that, to grab onto rocks that can sometimes get smooth. But as far as the camouflage aspect of it, if the scales are not smooth, there's going to be less light reflecting off of them, and that's going to be noticed less in the rocks. So if you think of you sitting in a rock cave with a mirror and the sun reflects off of it, I'm going to see you. But if, you know, you're wearing, let's say, brownish or rock colored clothes that are rough and they're not a slick surface, whatever that material is more of a textured fabric, the sunlight's not going to glance off of that and alert anyone to your presence. So it not only probably helps them grip onto the rocks, but it helps them camouflage themselves in the rocks. So do you have any questions? I mean, there's a lot. It's a big chapter in the book, and there's a whole scientific paper about them. They're just super interesting because they're the only python species that has keeled scales, because they don't have this ontogenetic color change. They're the same color as adults as they are when they're born, but they can change color over several hours from lighter to darker brown. And because their closest living relative is the Morelia viridis, the green tree python, but their body shape is similar, but, you know, green tree pythons are very brightly colored and these rough scale pythons are brown. Another interesting thing, they have no black pigment whatsoever on their body. So they are unique in that way, that they're dark and they're brown, but they absolutely have no black pigment.
Yep.
So they're just really neat. Mine is very docile. He's not skittish. He's not flighty. He's not as active as my other Morelia. So they are a sister taxon to Morelia spilota. So their closest relatives are the green tree pythons, and their next closest relatives would be the carpet pythons, Morelia spilota. They're not as sedentary as green tree pythons. They're not as active as Bredl's pythons or carpet pythons. They're somewhere in the middle. So mine wakes up every night and comes out and moves around his enclosure, and he usually finds some rocks to sit out on. But if I open his enclosure door, he may or may not come out. He's not like eager to like, oh, let me out of my enclosure and I'm going to roam all over the room. Whereas pretty much every Bredl's python I own, if I open the enclosure, they're going to be out roaming around the room. I can handle him with no problem. He recently went for his annual vet checkup and he was really good at the vet. The first thing he did was find the bird perch that they use when they have bird patients. And he got in an ambush position on the bird perch in the exam room. I don't know if that was because it smelled like birds or because he was just comfortable perching that way, but they do perch in ambush position that way on a branch or off of a rock. And mine eats birds, he eats quail and chicks, and he eats mice and rats, and he eats reptilinks. I haven't noticed that he's picky as an adult, but I have read that when you're trying to get them started as hatchlings, they do prefer amphibian or avian foods, so birds or like frogs when they're babies. So I don't think that this species starts eating mammals until they're older. And they eat something called a rock rat. And these rock rats, they have skin that can slough off. And that is an evolutionary adaptation to avoid predation.
Yep.
And so rough-scale pythons have a huge mouth gape. So their mouth gape to their body size ratio is the largest among pythons. They can really drop their lower jaw down, and they can also separate it into more of a square flat surface. So they have this huge mouth gape, and they have really enlarged maxillary teeth in the back. So green tree pythons also have this, and it is thought that they have such big teeth so that when they're grabbing these rock rats and the rock rats slough off their skin to get away, that they can actually penetrate through that skin into the actual animal's muscle and have them not get away. So an example of that evolutionary arms race, where the prey species develops adaptations to get away from the predator, and the predator develops adaptations to make sure the prey can't get away. And that is just speculation as to why they have such large teeth and this big mouth gape ability, so that they can grab these rats and make sure they don't get away. The mouth gape thing is also an anti-predator defense. So when they get really stressed, they will gape their mouth open and actually come at you with their mouth gaped open like that as a defensive mechanism to warn you away. And if you don't go away, they will bite you.
I'm actually really surprised you didn't bring up their eyes.
Well, their eyes. So I've read that they have blue eyes, but mine doesn't.
Yours doesn't? Aw.
No.
Everyone that I've ever seen or interacted with, they always have. It varies. It's never like a really, really dark one, but it's always a little bit tinted that turquoise color.
I mean, the eyes are very, very pretty, and I'm just not seeing the blue in it though.
Oh.
I find them more like yellowish. But I'll definitely put some pictures up.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that in Summer's video, if you guys go check that out on Girl with Scales channel, she did one of, because she has 2 rough scale pythons. She actually has the brother to mine. She mentioned their blue eyes, but I don't really see it. Maybe I'm just not seeing the blue.
Maybe you're one of the people that saw the dress that's gold and black instead of blue and white or whatever.
Yeah, maybe so.
Maybe. I don't remember. It was a whole thing about that.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
So I'm going to overlay lots of pictures and videos, because we talked a lot about this, but they're a cool species. I really have no gripes about them at all. I think they make a good pet. They don't get that large. They stay around 5.5 feet. I've read that they can get up to 6.5 feet, but I don't think mine's going to get that big. They have a really big head in relation to their body. Their body's kind of skinny and long and lanky, and it's a little bit laterally flattened, which makes sense because they're arboreal. They live in rocks and trees, and they're up off the ground a lot, and they have to coil and wrap around stuff and grab onto stuff. So they're not rounded. Their head is just really big. And then they have a definitive thin neck and thin body, but it can get quite long. So they're not a big thick snake, but they can get long.
Yep, they're really cool. It's like a green tree python with almost Amazon tree boa proportions with bull snake skin.
Yeah, they're really, really cool.
Yeah, they're really fun.
I'll list all those resources so that you guys can all learn more about them yourselves. But I really don't think there's a downfall to having one as a pet. I haven't noticed any. You know, there are some snakes I definitely recommend to clients. Probably not a good idea if you're looking for a pet that you can do all of these things with. But the rough scale python's pretty mellow. And I think if you do choice-based interactions and you're not flooding it from the beginning and you're not making it afraid of you, that it's a nice pet. He's mellow, he's docile. You know, he's visible. I see him a lot. He was absolutely fantastic at the vet. Everybody had to come touch him, all the technicians and everything, and come see him. So I like them.
I know I need to get some soon.
Yeah, so like I said, there's clutches this year.
I know I need to be good, and I need to continue expanding more cages than getting more species right now is what I need to keep telling myself. Because
oh yeah, and you know,
much more
speaking of
important.
that, we didn't do the what's new with you at the beginning. So what's
That's
new with
technically
you?
true. With me is I am currently I am building to have a very busy summer is what I am doing right now. So we are looking into adding in more permanent plumbing to our building, which is going to be really fun. Because right now in the negative 24 plus degree winters that we are getting, our water line is still freezing in the winter. So I'm still having to walk buckets back and forth in like December and January. So we're hoping to add in more permanent water line, which is going to be a whole thing. We are looking to expand more cages to get away from more of these racks to where essentially the smallest rack I will have for any non-baby neonate snake will be 41 quarts. That'll be the smallest size tub that we'll have for any snake that is essentially moved on from eating consistently and will not be available for the public, will be part of our breeding program or ambassador program. That'll be the smallest size quart snake we have for babies. And then we're working with a ton of new species this year. I haven't really announced it to anybody yet because they're still technically in quarantine, but they're doing really well. I'm a big fan of the genus Goniosoma, which is the rhino rat snakes, rain rat snakes, and the Asian red-tailed rat snakes. And a good associate of mine went, "Hey, I have the ability to get these two species. Do you want them?" And I said, "I mean, that'd be really cool, but I don't know what I'm going to do about that. I don't know how to afford it." And then 2 days later, I get a phone call that says, "Hey, pick up your snakes." So I now they're in quarantine. They are being treated for external mites, and they are now eating consistently, which is really good. And then I'll be able to start treating for internal parasites. I have a sexed pair of Asian red-tailed rat snakes. The male is silver phase, the female is green, and they're both eating, which is the hardest thing to do with these guys. They're both pretty little. And then I have a pair of Jansen or black-tailed rat snakes, which basically look like if you took the brightest, cleanest black-tailed Crebo and put it to like a European rat snake. They look amazing. And the female hates my guts.
Why do you say that about so many of your snakes? I hear you say that about quite a few of your snakes.
They do. They don't like interactions. That's why I don't bring them out on video a lot, because I don't like to stress animals out more than necessary. I don't like to show bites on video. And it's not like a rosy boa that just sometimes goes, "What's this?" and decides to munch. It's a general fear reaction that they have. And again, they're wild caught animals. Is what I learned post afterwards, but it makes sense to what they are. But they're doing very well and they're acclimating pretty well. And so that's a good step. So we're doing that, as well as our actual ranch infrastructure is just needing to be vamped up quite a bit, as well as we are potentially going to be having our dual registered livestock guarding dog, our very first litter this year. So essentially come time end of June, when I'm supposed to be doing a reptile expo, and then the following like 2 days later a reptile talk in Denver, we will potentially have 2 to 3 boa litters, several different species of snakes that I've never worked with, and puppies all at the same time. So haha.
So you're crazy, basically.
I thought that was fairly well established at this point that I am a masterpiece of self-destruction. But yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll have to keep up with all that.
Right.
I mean,
How about
I'm
you?
as busy as ever with behavior research, and I'm working, as you know,
Mhm.
with a pair of researchers from the United Kingdom on a Python Regis habitat use study. And so right now we're designing the study. We're seeking ethical approval from Sparsholt University Center in the UK. And then it's going to have a citizen science component. So we're seeking, right now, we're getting all of the enclosures and equipment together. Lots of that is being donated. And when we know for sure who's sponsoring and donating enclosures and equipment, we will announce that. And then what we still need above what's donated, we're going to crowdfund so that we can basically give each participant all of the furnishings so that all of the enclosures are set up identical. And then we're going to do what's called a spread of participation index, where you divide up the enclosure into numbered zones, and there's a formula that you use. So through direct observation or surveillance video, you note where the snakes are at given times, and you put that in this formula, and it shows you how much of a habitat an animal is using. And zoos do this. It's not just for reptiles or snakes. Zoos will do this for entire habitats like a tiger or lion habitat, to get an idea of what the animals are using, what they're not using, and what their preferences are.
Yep.
And so we're doing this with Python Regis. We hope to have 20 animals participating, and Jay-Z is going to participate in that with one or two of his animals. And I'm going to participate with some of mine. And then we're going to have some citizen scientists participating as well. So in addition to that, my patrons are looking into testing enrichment objects. So we're trying to see if companies want to send us a few enrichment items for us to test with our snakes one at a time and see, do the snakes use them or not? So I'm doing a lot like that. My Patreon community is an educational platform. Like, my Patreon is a way for me to teach extra classes, to educate. And so my patrons join to take courses and be trained and be coached. And then we do studies, and they like to participate in those. So I'm busy doing that, as well as finishing up my bachelor's in animal health and behavior. And I'm applying to grad school at Virginia Tech. So I'm just busy with all of that kind of stuff, as well as running the animal sanctuary and taking care of the horses and dogs and cats and other animals here.
And I'm crazy.
Yeah, but that's why we get along.
Yeah.
Right? We usually end with a few questions. And so I will start by asking Jay-Z to finish up, and then I'll answer the question that was slated for me. What worries you the most about the future for keeping reptiles? So what worries you the most about the future for the keeping community? And that could be for keepers or for the well-being of the animals themselves.
So in that case, it's a really weird double-edged sword, and that is social media. Social media is the single greatest and the worst enemy to anyone in this hobby industry, anybody who likes to keep and interact with these animals. It gets to show them into a much wider audience, to reach out farther, to show how amazing and cool and beautiful and misunderstood that these animals are. But it also, like the curse of social media, propagates a lot of bad or misinformation about them. It makes a really good platform for lack of a better term, clout seekers who free handle venomous snakes, or this isn't really the case a whole lot anymore, but the people who would do like the live feedings and stuff, where they were never watched any of them, but we all know what I'm referring to where it sets a really good example of how really cool it can be, and we can share it and spread it. But it also, from outsiders looking in, either from a place of misplaced ignorance or essentially the destruction of it, to allow them to predate on either in a situation without context, or taking something and running with it, essentially kicking while they're down. And that is something that is really good and I'm really excited for, that I also use, to grow my presence and business and outreach programs. But it's also something that is greatly harming people that we've seen in great deal. And the way that, how social media is being presented by our country's government and everything right now is in the air. But regardless of that, it will still always be an omnipresent thing and will probably be a bigger part of our lives moving forward, regardless of what platform or whatever it will be, which could allow for a lot of bad things.
So when you use social media, I use social media, what is your goal and objective? And what do you try to convey through your own use of social media?
My own use is essentially just growing education and proper information and humility above all, where we have learned so much about these animals, about husbandry techniques, about proper behavior, nutrition, but this is still a relatively new and young field. And we need to actually build on that. And when new information presents itself, or being able to take a part of that to better and grow that in that hobby, we need to be able to admit when, hey, we may have taken some missteps, or these are ways we can improve that, versus, hey, look at this cute baby I made, which I still do because it helps draw that in, but that's just a draw. It's not necessarily just clickbait or whatever it is, but it's actually to put good information out to the world.
Right. And I know that I try to use it the same way. I try to use it as an educational platform.
Yep.
To educate, to be a science communicator, to educate about animal behavior science, animal welfare science, animal training science, to show animals in a positive light, to show them cooperating in their own care with people. So mine is never going to show anything sensational or anything wild. It's going to show stuff that's real, that's educational, and that's calm, because my interactions with the animals should be calm. They should be smooth, because that's what we're striving for here. And I absolutely try to show snakes in a positive light, always, and celebrate the snake for the beautiful and intelligent animals they are. And I know I see a lot that's not that about snakes and other animals on social media. So that stuff I just ignore and I don't share and I don't comment on, because it doesn't really do any good. I just try to do what I do and leave it there.
Yep, exactly. It's I actually had a I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent. I apologize.
That's okay.
It's going to go long, but I actually had a conversation with somebody in an outreach program that I was doing, who asked, what do I do to get people over their fear of these snakes? And it's a lot of the time, it's kind of what you said. It's being exposed to it. It's being, if you live in a very small community and you only are around people that look like you, that dress like you, that act like you, that believe the same thing you do, you don't understand what it's like to be in all these other communities. And the same thing goes with animals. If all you've ever been taught is that snakes are bad, icky, ooh, scary, and that's, I'm not picking on any one thing. It's across all human history that we've done this, that we're always picking on. Snakes are always the bad guys, just in general, across the world. Forever and always they have been. But when you have someone that's knowledgeable and that's passionate about it and that is calm and can talk about that and show these animals exhibiting natural behaviors and seemingly to either want to be or inquisitive or almost enjoy the interactions, and to be able to see that, the advent of social media being able to spread that to a much wider audience helps expose people to that. And that's what is really cool about it. But it allows people who don't want that at all to predate that, essentially, to take those bad situations of people playing with a cobra or things like that nature, or people who have alligators in their bathtubs and things, because that's still happening, as I've come to find out.
Okay. Yeah. You know more about that than I do. I try to live in my own positive bubble. And sometimes I have sleep disturbances if I see too much outside of my own positive bubble, and I don't need that because I'm very busy and I'm trying to focus on things and I need sleep. So some of the things that go on in the world are just too disturbing. And I'm aware, but I don't want to see that all the time. I don't want to look at that every day. I don't want to open up the headlines and read more about it.
I
And I
understand
guess
that.
the question that you guys had for me was what's a challenge that I've had lately. And I would say that it is staying positive with the current state of affairs in the world, in not just the reptile community, the horse world, the animal community, in our world in general, because I don't understand the behavior of people and why they're violent, why they do things that make no sense to me in the 21st century, where there's really no need to behave the way that they behave. So I have a challenge sometimes staying positive and continuing to do what I do and trying to shut out the wars and the politics and the cruelty to animals and the negative emotional responses that some people have to the things that we do as science communicators and as reptile keepers and things like that. Sometimes it really gets me down. I start really feeling depressed and like, if I could move to another planet, I would, but I can't. So I'm stuck here. So I just try to keep moving forward and doing what I do and staying positive and worrying about what I can control, which is the animals under my care.
Yep, absolutely. It's seems to be a growing thing where escape isn't really the best word, but it's a comfort. It's a place to where you can focus on these things that you can control that give you a really nice outlet that you can at least for a minute to just sit there and, just watch your animals, to take your animals out, to just kind of watch them do what they do.
Well, and it's a good feeling when you know that they have the best life that they can possibly have under captive management. They're in captivity, so we've already taken away their freedom. But when we can give them the best life possible and make that a choice-rich life and give them as many opportunities as we can, and we see that they're thriving and that they are not depressed and they're exhibiting behaviors that are enjoyable for them to do and enjoyable for us to watch, then that's a good feeling. And I try to focus on that with all of the species I work with, not just with the snakes.
Yep, absolutely.
So with that, let's all try to remain positive until we do this again. I want to thank everybody for joining us here on Colorado Reptile Educators. We appreciate your time and your commitment to helping reptiles thrive.
Absolutely.